أعلن افتتاح جلسة مجلس الأمن 8988. جدول الأعمال المؤقت لهذا الاجتماع هو الأخطار التي تهدد السلام والأمن الدوليين. أقر جدول الأعمال. وفقاً للمادة 37 من النظام الداخلي المؤقت للمجلس، أدعو ممثل أوكرانيا إلى المشاركة في هذه الجلسة. تقرر ذلك. وفقاً للمادة 39 من النظام الداخلي المؤقت للمجلس، أدعو مقدمي الإحاطتين التاليين إلى المشاركة في هذه الجلسة: السيد مارتن جريفيثس، وكيل الأمين العام للشؤون الإنسانية ومنسق الإغاثة في حالات الطوارئ; السيدة كاثرين راسل، المديرة التنفيذية لمنظمة الأمم المتحدة للطفولة. تقرر ذلك. يبدأ مجلس الأمن الآن نظره في البند 2 من جدول الأعمال. أعطي الكلمة الآن للسيد مارتن جريفيثs.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and congratulations on presiding over this council in these extraordinary times. We're here, of course, to speak about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and yet none of us want to be here today. We already had enough on our hands, many other unnecessary and unwanted conflicts leaving misery in their wake. We had no need for another war, which would have such a swift and sweeping impact for what Filippo Grandi has called the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Today, indeed, is not a day we had in mind. In the weeks before the military offensive began in Ukraine, and despite the din of commentary and rhetoric and prediction, humanitarian organizations went about their business. They've been working in the Donbass region, providing 1.5 million people there with humanitarian aid, a business they have been doing quietly and without funfair these past 8 years. And they're doing it still today, however and whenever they can. But of course, the humanitarian agencies, also prepared for worse to come. 2 weeks ago, few thought the scenario in which we find ourselves today, one of such intense conflict, was thinkable. It was essentially unplannable from the humanitarian operational perspective, and yet that humanitarian community did plan. We looked to the possible numbers with the UNHCR and IOM and our NGO partners and UNICEF and WFP. We estimated together who might be in need, who might be on the move, all those vulnerable people who might need help at home. We looked at possible routes and methods of delivery. The World Food Programme mobilized its considerable logistics to get supply chains up and running from a standing start. We knew that this operation would need the best of talent, and all humanitarian agencies, and including my office, sent in surge staff in the days before that offensive began. And as the unthinkable became the reality, the UN and its humanitarian partners started a scalable and agile, adaptable and resilient humanitarian operation fit for the changing situation. They started it. The Secretary General, at record speed, appointed Amin Awad, a person of the widest experience of fast-moving operations, including in that very region, as his crisis coordinator. Amin, supported by Osnat Lubrani, the experienced resident and humanitarian coordinator, is in Ukraine as we meet here today. In the first days of the offensive, our staff, like so many in Ukraine, spent their days and nights working from bunkers and basements. Yet they managed to produce the two robust response plans which Filippo and I launched last week in Geneva to a very generous donor response. Madam President, do I need to describe what we have all seen and heard on the news? Simply put, millions of lives shattered. People can't stay home with shops shut, power and water cut, shells falling, phones switched off. They can't find what they need even if they have money to pay for it. And as we have seen, even as the TV cameras roll, many can't flee in safety either in this conflict. It's been 11 days of escalating violence, fear, and pain. As of 6th of March, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 1,207 civilian casualties, including at least 406 dead, and I guess the real figure could be considerably higher. UNHCR reports that more than 1.7 million refugees have fled, and that figure is probably out of date already, in 11 days. Madam President, humanitarian assistance has continued in areas where security permits. Under the leadership of the crisis coordinator and the resident and humanitarian coordinator in country, we have new plans now, of course, on how to deliver where humanitarian needs are most acute. This includes the cities that we have seen so much on these last days, such as Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson. Our response is being scaled up from hubs in Vinnytsia, Uzhhorod, and Lviv. The UN and our partners, and we will hear, I'm sure, from Kathy in a minute, have already provided food to hundreds of thousands. The World Food Programme is setting up supply chain operations to deliver immediate food and cash assistance to 3 to 5 million people inside Ukraine. WHO has shipped trauma care, emergency surgery commitment, and other supplies that will help in days to come thousands of people, and more supplies are on their way. HCR is providing assistance, albeit as a small scale at the moment, through a network of shops and supermarkets in Mariupol in collaboration with NGOs. MSF never left. It's training trauma surgeons, providing support for the people in that city. It's bringing in thousands, UNHCR is bringing in thousands of blankets, mattresses, and other non-food items from Poland. Thank you to Poland, and shipping them to transit centers. And we're going to hear, and I look forward to hearing a lot more about the experience of children from Kathy, from the vital work of UNICEF and its partners. The Ukrainian Red Cross has distributed humanitarian assistance to thousands via its emergency stockpiles, including hygiene and food kits, warm clothing, and medicine. And I would like to take the chance here to salute the more than 4,000 Ukraine Red Cross volunteers across the country, used to conflict, of course, the community workers also of local NGOs, the truck drivers carrying basic necessities into volatile areas. These are people all in harm's way who have no hesitation in carrying out their mission. Madam President, I see three immediate priorities to lessen the pain and suffering we're all watching unfold in real time. First, the parties need to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian homes and infrastructure in their military operations. This includes allowing safe passage for civilians to leave areas of active hostilities on a voluntary basis in the direction they choose. All civilians, whether they stay or leave, must be respected and protected. Second, we need safe passage for humanitarian supplies into areas of active hostilities. Civilians in places like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Melitopol, and elsewhere desperately need aid, especially life-saving medical supplies, the kind that have been brought in these past days by WHO. Many modalities are possible, but it must take place in line with the parties' obligation under the laws of war. And thirdly, we urgently need a system of constant communication with the parties to the conflict and assurances to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid. And we have seen these systems in place in other countries, of course, as you know well. A humanitarian notification system, as we term it, can support delivery of aid at the scale needed. I have already conveyed these 3 points to the authorities of Ukraine and to the Russian Federation. And on the third point, thanks to the cooperation with the Russian Federation, my office has sent a team to Moscow to work on better humanitarian civil-military coordination that can allow us to scale up, precisely to begin to establish a humanitarian notification system. This follows last Friday's phone call between the Secretary General and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu. UN teams have held the first technical meeting with the representatives of the Ministry of Defense. I welcome cooperation by both sides and sincerely hope to see further progress in the hours ahead. Madam President, people are watching as this unnecessary conflict engulfs cities and civilians. As well as what's happening in Ukraine, they have an extra sense of dread over the impact this will have on the wider world. I include myself in this category. I'm deeply worried about the consequences on vulnerable people living half a world away. Food prices are spiking, supplies are uncertain. We didn't need that either. People in the Sahel, in Yemen, the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, Madagascar, and already face profound food insecurity. Record-level fuel prices means life becomes harder still in places like Lebanon, where generators keep hospitals open and water treatment plants working. And the extraordinary generosity, which I welcome and praise, of donors to the launch of the regional plan and the Ukraine humanitarian response plan. We hope that this will not divert those donors from other pressing humanitarian crises. This may be the latest one, but not the only one. So while we have planned, we have mobilized, we have fundraised to meet the challenge we face, we have the capacity and I think the know-how to meet the most urgent needs in Ukraine on the basis of cooperation with the parties. But, and here I would like to stress this particular last point, make no mistake, we are unable to meet the needs of civilians today. All those points that I have made are points in preparation, in supply, in redeployment, in getting to the right place. But we're failing to meet the needs of civilians today at this time. I hope we will not fail them tomorrow. Thank you, Madam President.
أشكر السيد جريفيث على إحاطته. أعطي الكلمة الآن للسيدة كاثرين راسل.
Excellencies and colleagues, it's my appreciation to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Ambassador Faret Hoja for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Ambassador Nusejba from the United Arab Emirates for hosting this briefing during your Security Council presidency. This is my first time briefing the Security Council as UNICEF Executive Director. I regret that it has been made necessary by the rapidly worsening situation in Ukraine and the unconscionable impact the conflict is having on Ukraine's children. The past 8 years of conflict in Ukraine have already inflicted profound and lasting harm to children. With the escalation of this conflict, the immediate and very real threat to Ukraine's 7.5 million children has grown. Homes, schools, orphanages, and hospitals have all come under attack. Civilian infrastructure like water and sanitation facilities have been hit, leaving millions without access to safe water. For many, life has moved underground as families seek safety in shelters, subways, or basements, often for hours on end. Women are giving birth in makeshift maternity wards with limited medical supplies. Most stores are closed, making it hard for people to buy essential items, including basic necessities for children like diapers and medication. And even if stores were open, millions of people are too afraid to venture outside for food or water because of continuous shelling and shooting. The intensification of the armed conflict is posing severe human costs, which are increasing exponentially by the day. As of today, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights recorded 1,207 civilian casualties in Ukraine. Since February 24, at least 27 children have been killed and 42 children have been wounded. Countless more have been severely traumatized. As the fighting has now reached densely populated areas and across the country, we expect child casualties to increase. We also expect the displacement crisis to continue growing rapidly. As of yesterday, UNHCR was reporting in excess of 1.7 million refugees fleeing to hosting countries. Half of the people on the move are children. UNICEF is working closely with UNHCR to reach them with protection and assistance in receiving countries. I've just returned from Romania-Ukraine border, where thousands of women and children traveled to escape the fighting. I met with mothers and children who had to flee their homes at a moment's notice. They told me how it felt to leave everything they know behind, to leave husbands, fathers, and elderly loved ones, not knowing when or if they would see each other again. The children talked about being suddenly pulled out of school, of losing beloved toys, and the terrifying sound of shelling and gunfire. So many children have been deeply traumatized. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are working 24 hours a day to meet rapidly escalating humanitarian needs in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. From trucking in safe water for drinking and hygiene, providing emergency medical services, and providing shelter and protection for those displaced from their homes. At present, we have some 135 people working for UNICEF in Ukraine, and we are sending more to meet needs in country. UNICEF-supported child protection mobile teams are reaching children wherever they can with psychosocial care, mental health support, and protection services. The operating environment in Ukraine is extremely complex. Access constraints and rapidly changing front lines make it much more difficult to deliver critical supplies and services. The safety and well-being of our staff on the ground remains a top priority. I also want to spotlight our local partners and other local humanitarian actors who continue to operate under extremely difficult security conditions, especially those working in the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts, regions that have been hard hit over the past several weeks. I'm very glad to tell you that on Sunday, UNICEF delivered 40 tons of medical life-saving items for children and mothers to 22 hospitals in 5 of the most affected regions. This equipment included midwifery and obstetrics kits, resuscitation and surgical kits, oxygen concentrators for shelters, hospitals, and first aid kits for frontline workers, enough to meet the needs of 20,000 children and their mothers. In coordination with the Ministry of Health, UNICEF is assessing further needs and preparing other shipments. UNICEF and our partners need flexible resources and safe, uninterrupted access to rapidly scale up our efforts to meet children's urgent needs, wherever they are, whether still in Ukraine or on the move. In collaboration with UNHCR, we have deployed teams to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and the Republic of Slovakia, and built on our ongoing presence in Romania, Moldova, and Belarus to support the urgent needs of children. We've begun operating Blue Dot safe spaces in hosting countries at border crossings where children are first registered. The hubs provide a one-stop safe space for children and their families. They offer a range of services, including places for children to play, psychosocial support, basic legal counseling, recreational kits, and hygiene products. I visited one of these last week. Staff at these hubs are also able to identify unaccompanied and separated children. Children without parental care are at a heightened risk of violence, abuse, and exploitation. When these children are moved across borders, the risks are multiplied. The risk of trafficking also soars in emergencies. UNICEF and UNHCR have urged all hosting countries to take measures to identify and register unaccompanied and separated children fleeing Ukraine after allowing them access to their country. Temporary foster care and other community-based care provided through a government system can help protect children who have been displaced without their families. But we want to stress that adoption should never occur during or immediately after emergencies. Every effort should be made to reunify children with their families. Inside Ukraine, UNICEF is also deeply concerned about the safety and well-being of the nearly 100,000 children, half of them with disabilities, who live in institutions and boarding schools. We have received reports of institutions understandably seeking to move children to safety in neighboring countries and beyond. Many of these children have living relatives or legal guardians. all of these children have the right to be protected. While we recognize that humanitarian evacuations may become necessary to save lives, special measures must be taken to contact relatives and obtain consent to move these children to safety and to reunify them with their families when the threat is past. With the spread of the conflict, we should all be extremely concerned about the risk posed to children by landmines and explosive remnants of war. Even prior to the recent escalation, eastern Ukraine was one of the most mine-contaminated stretches of land in the world. This brutal reality is rapidly extending to other parts of the country. We will continue doing everything we can for children in Ukraine. We are committed to stay and deliver, but we need your support. Excellencies, what is happening to children in Ukraine is a moral outrage. Images of a mother and her 2 children and a friend lying dead on the street, hit by a mortar as they tried to flee to safety, must shock the conscience of the world. We must act to protect children from this brutality. UNICEF calls upon the members of this council to remind all parties of their legal and moral obligation to protect children and spare them from attack. We remain extremely concerned about attacks on the civilian infrastructure necessary to help children weather this conflict, including schools, hospitals, water and sanitation facilities, and critical energy infrastructure. We call on all parties to refrain from fighting near or targeting these protected areas and from cyber attacks that can disrupt critical services for children and families. We appeal to all parties to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including cluster munitions, which pose the gravest risk of harm to children. And we urge all parties to protect civilians from further harm related to contamination from landmines and explosive remnants of war. UNICEF respectfully asks this council to send a strong message to all parties of their obligation to ensure the safety of humanitarian personnel and equipment and to permit and facilitate our work. This also means ensuring that sanctions and other restrictive measures do not impede humanitarian action. Finally, we have renewed our call for an immediate suspension of ongoing military actions in Ukraine. We need a ceasefire and adequate guarantees to enable safe and rapid humanitarian access to all people in need across Ukraine. This will allow critical humanitarian assistance and protection to reach those in need and to let families in those most affected areas venture out to get food and water, seek medical care, and leave their homes to find safety. In closing, I would like to emphasize that UNICEF is a humanitarian actor abiding by humanitarian principles. Over the past 8 years, UNICEF has been working on both sides of the line of contact in eastern Ukraine, and we are committed to providing humanitarian assistance and protection to all children in need across Ukraine and in neighboring countries. But this brutality must come to an end. Excellencies, colleagues, children in Ukraine need help and protection. They need supplies and other critical support. They need access to basic social services like health and education. They need hope for the future. But above all, children in Ukraine need peace. It is the only sustainable solution. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
أشكر السيدة راسل على إحاطتها. أعطي الكلمة الآن لأعضاء المجلس الراغبين في الإدلاء ببيانات. أعطي الكلمة لممثلة الولايات المتحدة.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Executive Director Russell. At your first briefing to the Council, we welcome you to this setting. And thank you also to Undersecretary General Griffiths. Both of your briefings were extraordinarily sobering, but we very much appreciate the work that you do. I also want to say that we're so appreciative and so proud and grateful to UNICEF and OCHA and other humanitarian agencies staff on the ground in Ukraine and throughout the region. We've seen the images of them coordinating deliveries from bomb shelters and continuing to provide assistance to the Ukrainian people under difficult and dangerous conditions. They are a testament to the life-saving work of the UN's humanitarian agencies and your indispensable role helping vulnerable civilians suffering the consequences of war. We're outraged by increased reports of Moscow's attacks harming Ukrainian civilians in its unprovoked and unjustified war against the Ukrainian people. President Putin's war of choice has already turned 500,000 children into refugees. Already more than 1.7 million civilians have fled Ukraine into surrounding countries, and this doesn't include those who have been internally displaced. We've seen the images of elderly fleeing, a woman killed in her wheelchair, children dying in their mother's arms, and a woman being rushed bleeding to a hospital. These are the images that we're seeing daily of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. Last week, I had the opportunity to speak to my counterparts from Romania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Moldova, where their governments, international organizations, and NGOs have been working nonstop to welcome all those who are fleeing. What I heard was staggering. My Polish colleague, who's sitting in the room with us today, shared that 100 refugees are crossing into Poland every minute. 100 a minute. Just do the math. We talked about many of the challenges these neighboring countries are facing and how the United States can help keep their borders open to all those seeking international protection, including those who may experience communication barriers with border agents due to disabilities or other factors. We're committed to providing support, and we know that their needs will only increase if Russia does not cease its violence. We know this because of what we've seen over the last week, from the reckless attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant, to the siege of cities across Ukraine, to the tragic images and alarming reports from those who are unable to leave Ukraine to seek safety. The world is haunted by these images of homes, hospitals, schools, orphanages being destroyed, demolished in front of our eyes. Child cancer patients unable to receive chemotherapy, babies delivered in basements instead of maternity wards, and hundreds of thousands of civilians without access to electricity, for heat, or drinking water to stay alive. Ukrainian cities are under siege, under relentless Russian shelling. Hospitals are running out of supplies, food is dwindling, and civilian casualties are mounting, while the most vulnerable group, those with disabilities, the elderly, children, continue to bear the brunt of suffering. We have seen besiegement before, from Leningrad to Aleppo. These are tragedies of immense proportions. The United States is closely coordinating with the government of Ukraine, neighboring countries, and international organizations, including those within the UN system, to monitor the situation, and we will work with them to address humanitarian needs both in Ukraine and in the region. While we are heartened by the international community's pledges of over $1.5 billion in humanitarian support so far, we know that as long as Russia pursues its relentless and brutal campaign, the need for assistance will only increase. We all need to ensure these pledged funds are flexible and mobilized as quickly as possible, given the escalating needs on the ground. But perhaps most important of all, we must heed the call we heard today from the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. That means a sustained pause in hostilities to allow the safe passage of civilians who wish to leave areas of active conflict, the safe passage of humanitarian supplies, and the free and safe movement of those delivering humanitarian assistance. We need Russia's firm, clear, public, and unequivocal commitment to allow and facilitate immediate, unhindered humanitarian access for humanitarian partners in Ukraine. Very specifically, we call for the Russian Federation to agree to and honor In good faith, Ukrainian proposals for time-bound humanitarian safe passage in specific agreed-upon locations. We call for the establishment of a ground-level notification system that will facilitate the safe movement of humanitarian convoys and flights. This is imperative for ensuring humanitarian supplies and commodities can be reliably transported into Ukraine to reach those most in need. I also want to note today that the United States is increasingly concerned about the protection of civilians in this conflict, particularly women and girls who are vulnerable to gender-based violence, LGBTQI Ukrainians, as well as Ukraine's population of older adults and people with disabilities. We also call for the protection and care of all vulnerable children, including separated and unaccompanied children and those in institutional care. Children should never be involved in conflict, period. Children should never be involved in conflict. They must be protected. The humanitarian toll of President Putin's war on Ukraine is mounting. Children are dying. People are fleeing their homes. And for what? As UNICEF has reported, we know already that dozens of children have been killed in Putin's war. And as we work to confirm cases, we know the actual numbers are actually far greater. Young children have also been severely traumatized by the violence and destruction. They've witnessed so many things to the point that they've stopped speaking. The physical and psychological wounds of this war will be long-lasting. It's clear Mr. Putin has a plan to destroy and terrorize Ukraine. If the last 2 weeks have shown us anything, it's that the Ukrainian people are not going to give up. And many Russian people themselves, including many Russian soldiers, do not want this war. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin doesn't seem to be listening, and we are concerned that the world needs to be prepared for a very long and very difficult road ahead. The Ukrainians are defending themselves bravely, and we will continue to stand with them and support them. But President Putin is clearly willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands of Russian soldiers to achieve his personal ambitions. We have been warning Moscow for weeks that in the end, Russia will be weaker and not stronger for launching this war. This is already proving true. The question is how much devastation President Putin is willing to wreak for this enormous mistake. We continue to call on Russia to change course, withdraw its forces, de-escalate through diplomacy, and we support Ukraine's call for a ceasefire. In the meantime, we applaud those doing everything in their power to alleviate the suffering Putin has unleashed on the Ukrainian people. Whatever course Russia's invasion may take, we must do everything, and I stress everything we can to help the people of Ukraine. Kyiv still stands, and we stand with Kyiv. We stand with Ukrainians. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات المتحدة على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة لممثل ألبانيا.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Executive Director Russell, and welcome to the Council. And thank you as well, USG Griffiths, for this sobering and painful briefing. More than that, thank you for everything you and your teams are doing in meeting as much as you can the huge and increasing humanitarian needs in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, today marks the 12th day of the unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine, a war of choice that is becoming a war of obsession. Like in every day of this senseless war, Ukraine and its brave citizens find themselves in the well-known sickening inevitability of every conflict. Civilians are killed, children are traumatized, and women are suffering. In less than 2 weeks, Russia managed to create, out of nothing and for no reason, the fastest and largest mass refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. We were told that this so-called special operation, the domestic nickname and the new Russian definition for aggression, would not target civilians. In reality, civilians are assaulted and trapped among rubble. Toddlers are sheltering in cellars and subway tunnels. And as we saw last week, nuclear plants are under threat of deliberate or accidental hit. Fueled by anger due to the heroic Ukrainian resistance, civilian population, civilian infrastructure, residential areas, schools and hospitals, as we heard, everything has become a target. Even diplomatic representations are not spared, as it happened today with our own honorary consulate in Kharkiv. Dear colleagues, the huge humanitarian needs across the country are multiplying by the hour. Hundreds of thousands are without safe drinking water because of damage to system infrastructure, and many have been cut off from access to other essential services like health care. More than 1 million people are on the move, searching for shelter and safety, including in neighboring countries. Families have been walking long distances in freezing temperatures to find shelter, most of them in neighboring countries. Half of them are children. We applaud the way Poland, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia have responded in welcoming and sheltering hundreds of thousands of displaced people. They must not be left alone. The escalating aggression in Ukraine has been terrifying, especially to children. Tens of thousands of children have seen their daily lives and routines shattered. Thousands are separated from their families in shock and desperate for safety. This is what Russia is doing. So I have some very simple, direct questions. What in the world can justify exposing children to such extreme violence and unbearable levels of fear and anxiety? Where is the humanity of a great nation? Where is the responsibility of a great power? Where are the commitments of a permanent member of this body? Does international humanitarian law have still any meaning for Russia today? The answers lie under the blood of innocent Ukrainians. Dear colleagues, Russia's actions are a gross violation of Geneva Conventions and are classified as war crime under the Rome Statute. It must be made clear that if anyone in Russia thinks that what they are doing in Ukraine is a rendezvous with history and get away with atrocities and crimes against humanity, they must think twice. There will be accountability. Albania was among 38 countries to refer Ukraine to the ICC prosecutor. We fully support his work to gather proof and document crimes committed to present them to the court. It is therefore urgent to open secure humanitarian corridors for the safe evacuation of civilians and for the delivery of medicine and food. The Russian side must stop ignoring the appeals of international humanitarian organizations, in particular the International Committee of the Red Cross, to cease fire in order to create safe conditions for the departure of civilians and wounded without discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, or migration status. Differentiation between people on any ground, especially on the basis of race or ethnicity, are legally unjustifiable and morally and ethically unacceptable. Dear colleagues, there is a devastating bloody war on the ground, but there is another nasty war in the background. The latter concerns information. We remain worried about developments within Russia itself regarding freedom of information. With the latest measures taken by the parliament, authorities in Russia have shut down foreign broadcasters whose work becomes impossible under the law which criminalizes independent reporting in the country. The last major local independent broadcasters, TV Drozh and Eko Moskvy Radio, were shut down last week. We know from our own terrible communist past that attacking freedom of information in this way is the first sign of a dictatorship. When a government is afraid of its own people, it has a fundamental problem. Russian citizens have the right to know why their country attacked its neighbor. They need to be informed about the actions of their army against the people of Ukraine. Mothers must know why their sons are dying. And Russians deserve better than doctored propaganda. Otherwise, they would only hear about the fictional Ukrainian genocide in Donbass, which never happened, about Ukraine attacking Russia, which never happened, or about Russia winning the war, which is not happening. Madam President, protection of civilians should remain a top priority. Yet as bombardments intensify, fueled by the anger caused by the heroic Ukrainian resistance, we are also worried about the destruction of cultural heritage. Indiscriminate bombardments have already destroyed architectural ensembles in Kharkiv and risk inflicting irreparable damage to the Ukrainian cultural heritage widely. Heritage is a testimony of the past, but also a vector of peace for the future, which Russia is assaulting. Let me end with the cry of this woman, Alexandria, living in Kharkiv. This was last week, and I don't know whether she's still alive. She was saying, my city is being shelled, but my mom won't believe me. Her mom, who lives in Russia, would respond to her call that she heard on TV that the Russian army would never target civilians. It's Ukrainians who are killing their own people. Dear colleague, 12 days ago, Ukraine was guilty because it exists. Now they are guilty because they do not surrender. What is tomorrow made of for them? We call on Russia to come to senses and stop. We call on Russia to hold its aggression and go home. The world knows what they are doing. What is happening is a global air raid siren, a warning of how important multilateralism is and how much we need it to work and how essential it is to make everything possible to stop this war and make the aggressor pay for it. When one behaves like a rogue state, it should not pretend to be treated differently. Albania reaffirms its unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and this position was reiterated today, just a few hours ago, by a resolution adopted by the Albanian Parliament. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل ألبانيا على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل الاتحاد الروسي.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. Мы признательны Мартину Гриффитсу за представленные оценки. Приветствуем на заседании нового исполнительного директора ЮНИСЕФ Кэтрин Рассел. Благодарим ее за доклад. Хотел бы отметить, что мы видели непредвзятость ЮНИСЕФ при реагировании на конфликт на Украине в течение всех 8 лет его течения, его существования. Фонд не закрывал глаза на бомбежки Донбасса на территории ДНР и ЛНР и вытекающие из этого проблемы детей, от гуманитарных до психологических. Рассчитываем на такую непредвзятость и впредь. Но полагаем, что оценки ЮНИСЕФ должны основываться с опорой на достоверные и проверенные факты. Приветствуем отражение в гумплане опасного факта массового распространения на территории Украины легкого и стрелкового оружия, большая часть которого попадает в руки радикально настроенных элементов, в том числе намеренно освобожденных из заключения. Последствия такого безответственного поступка Зеленского, отдавшего соответствующий приказ, уже налицо. Количество жертв среди мирного населения от рук радикалов растет с каждым днем, в первую очередь в Киеве. Мы уже давно призываем обратить на это внимание. Призываем всех коллег по Совету Безопасности четко придерживаться сегодня гуманитарного контекста ситуации на Украине. У нас уже были возможности дать политические оценки происходящему. Очевидно, что у нас с вами они не сходятся. И вы по-прежнему полны решимости с опорой на мнение украинских политиков, а также сомнительные и откровенные ложные материалы из соцсетей, выставить в неприглядном свете ходы цели нашей специальной военной операции на Украине. Мы согласны с постпредом Албании, что в мире идет информационная война, точнее дезинформационная. Он только забыл сказать, что это на Западе, в свободном мире, отключают российские информационные ресурсы и не пропускают в эфир любую информацию, которая противоречит вашей версии событий и вашим фейкам. Постпред США нас сегодня обвинила, что мы не соблюдаем свои обязательства по созданию безопасных гуманитарных коридоров. Давайте в этом разберемся. Хотели бы вновь подчеркнуть, что опасность для мирных жителей на Украине представляют не российские военные, которые не осуществляют обстрелов гражданской инфраструктуры, а украинские радикалы и неонацисты, захватившие в заложники население ряда городов. Используя мирных граждан в качестве живого щита, они не дают им покинуть города, несмотря на наличие гуманитарных коридоров и объявление российскими подразделениями режимов тишины. Примеров тому множество. Так, 4 марта по линии Минобороны России с вице-премьером Украины Верещук были согласованы параметры гум-коридоров из Мариуполя в Запорожье и из Волновахи в Днепропетровск. Они должны были быть открыты с 10 утра 5 марта. По требованию Киева в районы открытия коридоров были приглашены представители МККК. Наша сторона была готова оказать всестороннее содействие при обеспечении безопасности в ходе эвакуации людей. Обо всем этом мы своевременно информировали секретариат ООН. Однако оказавшиеся в Мариуполе радикалы эту договоренность нарушили. Как следует из перехваченного разговора по радиосвязи двух командиров нацбатальона «Азов», находящимся в Волновахе радикалам было прямо указано стрелять в ноги тем, кто направится в сторону гум-коридоров. Тех, кто на свой страх и риск решил покинуть Мариуполь, на блокпостах на выезде из города украинские нацисты расстреливали на месте. Этому есть множественные видеодоказательства. По нашим данным, в одном только Мариуполе на прицеле у Азова находится 200 тысяч гражданских лиц, попавших в ловушку радикалов. В городах стремительно ухудшается гуманитарная обстановка. Готовые оказать помощь гуманитарщики не в состоянии туда попасть и предотвратить разворачивающуюся в городе катастрофу. Такое же критическое положение дел у людей в других районах страны, блокированных нацбатальонами. Отмечаем, что украинские радикалы с каждым днем все отчетливее показывают свое истинное лицо. Местные жители сообщают, что, выгнав весь персонал роддома номер 1 города Мариуполь, вооруженные силы Украины оборудовали в нем огневую позицию. Ими был полностью разрушен один из детских садов города. В дополнение к этому заявляем, что украинская сторона категорически отказывается взаимодействовать по вопросам эвакуации людей из Харькова и Сумы. Учитывая катастрофическую гуманитарную обстановку и ее резкое обострение в Киеве, Харькове, Сумах и Мариуполе, а также по личной просьбе президента Франции Макрона к президенту России Путину, вооруженные силы России объявили о том, что с 10:00 7 марта этого года объявляется режим тишины и открываются гуманитарные коридоры из Киева, Мариуполя и Сум как на территорию России для желающих эвакуироваться этим логистически надежным маршрутом, так и на территорию Украины. Указанная информация была доведена вчера вечером до Киева, профильной структуры ООН, ОБСЕ, МККК и других международных организаций через все имеющиеся информационные ресурсы, включая средства массовой информации. Официальный ответ от киевской стороны был получен только сегодня, в 7 часов 10 минут утра по московскому времени. При этом были проигнорированы открытые гум-коридоры в направлении Российской Федерации. Эту тему в своем официальном выступлении развела та же вице-премьер Украины Верещук, назвав предложение открыть гум-коридоры в сторону России, цитирую, «абсурдным и неприемлемым». Нам понятно, что киевский режим всеми доступными и недоступными методами всячески препятствует выходу желающих мирных граждан и иностранцев в Россию, поскольку боится, что люди, оказавшись на свободе, расскажут правду о действиях украинских радикалов, как это делают те люди, кому удалось вырваться из рук этих радикалов. Речь идет об угрозах, запугивании, шантаже, физическом насилии, применении оружия на поражение против мирных граждан и иностранцев. Приведу здесь в качестве иллюстрации одно лишь заявление мэра города Сумы Александра Лысенко, сделанное сегодня вместе с командиром национального батальона. Цитирую. «Никаких зеленых коридоров не будет. Ни один мирный житель не выйдет в Россию, а те, кто попытается это сделать, будут расстреляны». Конец цитаты. При этом, заявляя о невозможности эвакуации украинских граждан в России, украинские официальные лица игнорируют факт присутствия украинских беженцев в регионах России. Из зон проведения специальной военной операции в нашу страну эвакуировано более 168 тысяч человек. Из них 43 469 детей. В том числе за последние сутки 5550, из которых 740 детей. Государственную границу Российской Федерации пересекли 19 256 единиц личного автотранспорта, в том числе за последние сутки 900. Нами разворачиваются пункты временного размещения. Все они находятся в готовности к индивидуальной работе с прибывающими из Украины мирными гражданами. К сожалению, политизируются и вопросы эвакуации населения из других регионов, а также оказания гуманитарной помощи. В частности, абсурдными выглядят просьбы украинской стороны, озвученные нам менее чем за 3 часа до открытия гуманитарных коридоров, обеспечить эвакуацию из ряда населенных пунктов, находящихся под контролем российских вооруженных сил. При этом никто из жителей указанных населенных пунктов желания эвакуироваться не изъявил. Люди мирно живут в своих домах, им ничего не угрожает. Параллельно нас просят организовать эвакуацию населения из ряда городов, которые пока находятся под контролем национальных батальонов. Ну и, наконец, нас просят доставить украинские якобы гуманитарные грузы в Мелитополь, Бердянск, Запорожскую область и в город Херсон. Это тоже выглядит цинично по отношению к жителям указанных городов, так как в настоящее время эти районы находятся под полным контролем российских вооруженных сил, а их население продолжает жить мирно и обеспечено всем необходимым, в том числе гуманитарной помощью от России, которая поступила в разные регионы Украины, 550 тонн. Госпожа председатель, особую обеспокоенность у нас вызывает то, что украинские радикалы продолжают удерживать заложников в качестве живого щита в ряде городов более 1500 иностранцев. По их судьбе мы круглосуточно работаем с соответствующими дипломатическими ведомствами. При этом с чрезвычайными проблемами при попытке пересечь границу Украины столкнулись иностранцы, пытающиеся покинуть страну в европейском направлении. Речь идет о гражданах целого ряда государств, включая африканские страны. Обратили также внимание на публичные заявления сенегальского председательства Евросоюза по этому сюжету. Шокированы новостями о бесчеловечных атаках националистов на студенческие общежития, повлекшие в том числе гибель индийских студентов. Что касается безопасности персонала ООН на Украине, а для нас это один из приоритетов, то на сегодняшний момент российские военные обеспечили выход с Украины 180 ООНовцев. При необходимости поддержка будет продолжена. Находимся в постоянном контакте с секретариатом ООН. Мы со всей ответственностью подходим к решению гуманитарных проблем, с которыми сталкиваются мирные украинцы. 2 марта на базе Национального центра управления обороны России создан межведомственный координационный штаб по гуманитарному реагированию в связи с проведением спецоперации на Украине. Он работает в круглосуточном режиме. В состав штаба включены уполномоченные представители всех федеральных органов исполнительной власти, госкорпораций и субъектов Российской Федерации. Основные задачи штаба – оказание всестороннего гумсодействия населению Украины в контролируемых районах, а также Донецкой и Луганской народных республиках, обеспечение безопасности и эвакуации мирного населения Украины и иностранных граждан. Госпожа председатель, не могу не упомянуть еще об одном моменте. Размещение тяжелой военной техники, включая системы ПВО, РСЗО и ствольной артиллерии в густонаселенных районах уже стали не какими-то единичными случаями, а правилом для украинских нацбатальонов. Попытки местных жителей протестовать и требовать отвода техники жестко пресекаются угрозой применения оружия. Подобное трусливое поведение комбатантов по использованию гражданского населения в качестве заложников не только глубоко аморально, но и прямо нарушает нормы международного гуманитарного права, включая статьи 57 и 58 первого дополнительного протокола к Женевским конвенциям 1949 года. Кроме того, в ряде городов, особенно в Одессе, фиксируется размещение техники около или внутри объектов культурного наследия в нарушение статьи 53 упомянутого доп. Протокола. Срывы эвакуации мирного населения по гуманитарным коридорам являются нарушением статьи 75 упомянутого доп. Протокола. А публикуемые в соцсетях кадры пыток и издевательств над пленными российскими военнослужащими попирает статью 14 Женевской конвенции 1949 года, которая прямо гарантирует уважение к личности и чести военнопленных при любых обстоятельствах. Коллеги, я призываю вас дать всем этим вопиющим случаям должную оценку. Ожидаем того же и от руководства ООН. В противном случае вы лишь будете подбадривать украинских радикалов и неонацистов на новые преступления. Госпожа председатель, в заключение хотел бы еще раз настоятельно призвать наших западных коллег убедить украинское руководство подумать, наконец, о безопасности удерживаемых радикалами украинских и иностранных граждан и включиться в работу по открытию и обеспечению безопасности гумконидоров. Если, конечно, у вас остались рычаги влияния на националистов. По этому поводу у нас все больше и больше сомнений. Мы, с своей стороны, к такой работе готовы. Благодарю вас.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة إيرلندا.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'd first like to thank the UNICEF Executive Director, Catherine Russell, welcome her to the Chamber, and thank her and Under Secretary General Griffiths for their briefings today. Your messages were really, really stark, but we need to hear them. The international community needs to hear the facts. We commend the vital work of all humanitarians in Ukraine. And today, on the eve of International Women's Day, I salute the courage of all women working on the ground in Ukraine to save lives. The safety and security of all those brave individuals must be ensured. Madam President, one of the youngest fleeing over the weekend was a 2-month-old boy called Andrei, who crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland. As his Aunt Valentina comforted Andrei and his mother, she told UNHCR, "I never thought I would have to leave my home, that I would have to flee just to save my life." The Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine has now created nothing short of a humanitarian catastrophe. As a brutal war is waged, we are seeing little to no regard for the safety of civilians. Andrei and Valentina represent just 2 of the 1.7 million people who have become refugees in less than 2 weeks. "We gathered some things and fled," Valentina said. She had reason to. We now know that something in the order of 12 million people are in need of assistance. Thousands have been killed and injured, the human cost mounting by the day, a humanitarian catastrophe simply of tragic proportion. In densely populated cities, in villages and towns, Ukrainian civilians are forced to shelter for safety in underground car parks and metro stations. Their daily lives upended, everything on hold, terrorized. All the while, the use of explosive weapons destroy their homes and the civilian infrastructure they rely on for survival. We are hearing reports hourly of multiple attacks on medical facilities, including maternity and children's hospitals, even oncology clinics, all protected under international humanitarian law. We have looked on in horror as attempts to evacuate the estimated 200,000 people from Mariupol have failed. The ICRC has been clear: whatever is agreed or not agreed on humanitarian corridors or other measures, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. This applies both to those who choose to leave and to those who choose to remain. That's a core obligation under international humanitarian law. Each chilling violation of international law evokes the darkest days of Europe's past. President, the humanitarian consequences of damage to civilian infrastructure is not abstract. It means interrupted supplies of electricity, critical for the continuing functioning of hospitals and essential services. It means heating homes. It means enabling parents cook to feed their children. The Children's Hospital where Valentina worked as a volunteer was hit by artillery at the beginning of the invasion. As she looked at her nephew, she recalled the children she saw killed in that attack. She says simply, they were so small. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to uphold its international obligations. That includes protecting civilian healthcare facilities and protecting medical and humanitarian personnel. All parties must also facilitate safe passage and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, including medical and food supplies to those in need. A notification system and emergency helpline should be established to facilitate delivery of humanitarian aid. Ireland reiterates our call at last Friday's meeting for the immediate cessation of military activity by Russia against and at Ukraine's nuclear facilities in order to avert nuclear disaster and the subsequent humanitarian consequences. We note that over the weekend, the IAEA expressed grave concern at the situation at the Zaporizhia plant. President, as Ms. Russell so clearly set out for us today, the women and children of Ukraine are in the midst of a desperate protection crisis. The terror of war and the trauma of family separation will have lifelong effects on thousands of Ukrainian children. They will be marked forever by these days. As in all conflicts around the world, women and girls are especially vulnerable to the abhorrent scourge of sexual violence, sexual exploitation, and abuse. All women and girls in Ukraine must be protected from rape and social and sexual violence. We will work to ensure that there will be no place to hide from accountability for anyone who perpetrates crimes against them. President, in the face of the massive exodus of refugees from Ukraine, we once again commend our EU partners and Moldova for their continued generosity and solidarity. They are welcoming vulnerable people seeking to leave Ukraine without discrimination. We appeal to all countries in the region to keep their borders open to all those seeking safety and protection. Ireland is fully committed to supporting the humanitarian response, both domestically and in the region. The humanitarian impact of this war will be felt not just on the European continent. It will affect the food security situation in countries heavily reliant on Ukrainian agricultural products in Africa, in Asia, and in the Middle East, reminding us at this table once again of the inherent links between conflict and hunger. President, Ireland once again urges the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities, unconditionally withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to refrain from further threat of force or use of any kind of force against Ukraine or any other member state. Andrei and his family speak to the human face of this reprehensible conflict. Before any more lives are ruined or lost to this war, before more children die, before more families are separated, before it's too late, we plead one more time with the Russian Federation to choose dialogue and diplomacy over bombs and bullets. Thank you, Madam Chair.
أشكر ممثلة إيرلندا على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة لممثلة المملكة المتحدة.
Thank you, Madam President. And may I start by thanking too Martin Griffiths and Cathy Russell for their sobering briefings. I also want to add my thanks and appreciation for the work of your organisations, the courage of your staff, and the integrity of your reporting. Madam President, Martin, Cathy, and colleagues have already described in sobering detail the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. 1.7 million refugees, 1.7 million individual lives destroyed, and the UN expects this to rise to 4 million in the coming weeks. We've seen the devastation caused by Russian missiles and bombardment, including reports of cluster munitions in Ukrainian cities, apartment blocks torn apart, hospitals, schools in ruins, people left without electricity, food, water, and shelter. We can't turn the clock back. Russia's invasion has been met with fierce resistance by the Ukrainian people. In response, President Putin is directing a campaign of violence and cruelty against civilians. But let me be clear, we will hold Russia to account for its actions, and we will investigate thoroughly allegations of war crimes and violations of international law. Madam President, in response to this tragedy, the UK Prime Minister today announced a further $130 million of aid, which brings to a total the UK's support for Ukraine to $520 million. In addition, individual members of the British public have given over $130 million. This is intended to help Ukrainians in need and support neighbouring countries receive refugees. But as I've said before, what the Ukrainian people really need is an end to this invasion. So we appeal to Russia to end their war before they bring even more tragedy to the Ukraine and even more shame on their own nation. Vasily Alexeyevich, the great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, "Man is given not only one life, but also a conscience." I know that you've spoken under instructions today, but I ask you to report faithfully back to Moscow what you have heard today, the urgency of this Council's calls for peace. I thank you.
أشكر ممثلة المملكة المتحدة على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة لممثل المكسيك.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradezco las presentaciones de la directora ejecutiva Russell y del subsecretario general Griffiths. Como nos han informado, la situación humanitaria en Ucrania, a 11 días del inicio del conflicto, requiere de una acción urgente y coordinada con la participación de actores humanitarios imparciales. El reto es enorme. Hoy son ya 1.7 millones de refugiados, va a seguir creciendo, aproximadamente 1 millón de desplazados internos y seguramente muchos más que desean hacerlo, pero que aún no han podido ser evacuados. Y la mayoría, como hemos escuchado, son mujeres y niños. A esto se suman otras agravantes que se han presentado en los últimos días, de las cuales también nos han informado, como son las críticas condiciones de acceso a agua y alimentos en ciudades sitiadas. Llamamos con urgencia a una pausa sostenida de las hostilidades. La ayuda humanitaria no puede ni debe ser rehén de consideraciones políticas o de ataques militares. Se debe garantizar el acceso irrestricto y seguro de todos los trabajadores humanitarios en Ucrania y en todos los países colindantes de conformidad con el derecho internacional humanitario. Igualmente, se debe cumplir con lo dispuesto en la resolución 2573 en relación con la protección de civiles, de los bienes indispensables para su supervivencia y de la infraestructura imprescindible para la entrega de la ayuda humanitaria. Recordamos también que en dicha resolución el Consejo de Seguridad fue claro al exigir que todas las partes en los conflictos armados establezcan una pausa humanitaria para facilitar la entrega segura, sin trabas y sostenida de la asistencia requerida, así como la prestación de los servicios conexos por parte de agentes humanitarios imparciales, con arreglo a los principios humanitarios de neutralidad, imparcialidad e independencia, de conformidad con el derecho internacional, incluidas las disposiciones aplicables del derecho internacional humanitario y del derecho internacional de los refugiados. Señora Presidenta, quisiera hacer hincapié en 4 aspectos orientados a la acción en el terreno. Primero, es deplorable el uso de municiones en racimo en cualquier circunstancia. Estas tienen un impacto devastador en la población civil, incluso después de concluido el conflicto. Urgimos a cesar el uso de estas municiones en Ucrania y hacemos un llamado a aquellos estados que no lo hayan hecho a unirse ahora a la Convención sobre Municiones en Racimo. Segundo, se debe atender de manera urgente el impacto directo que tiene el conflicto en los más vulnerables, mujeres, niños y personas con discapacidad. Nos preocupan en particular en este éxodo masivo que está ocurriendo la situación de menores no acompañados y hacemos un llamado a que los mecanismos de monitoreo en vigor tengan un enfoque de género y tomen en consideración la situación de los niños, por lo que reconocemos y apoyamos la participación de UNICEF. Tercero, el establecimiento de una pausa humanitaria inmediata es necesaria para garantizar el acceso de los operadores humanitarios, así como el establecimiento de rutas de evacuación y tránsito de civiles que sean seguras. Los ataques a civiles en busca de refugio son violatorios del derecho internacional humanitario. Y cuarto, el impacto inmediato del conflicto es, en efecto, multidimensional, por lo que la ayuda humanitaria debe incluir la provisión de servicios de salud mental y de apoyo psicosocial. Señora Presidenta, insistiremos junto con Francia en las consultas para que este Consejo de Seguridad adopte una resolución eminentemente humanitaria que atienda los puntos que se han discutido en esta sesión. Es urgente que el Consejo retome su papel como principal órgano encargado de la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Esperamos que tanto esta reunión como las consultas que siguen sirvan para avanzar el diálogo y permitan acercar posiciones, alcanzar acuerdos con un solo propósito: auxiliar a las personas que requieren con urgencia de esta ayuda humanitaria. Muchas gracias.
أشكر ممثل المكسيك على بيانه. أعطي الكلمة لممثل فرنسا.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie M. Griffiths et Mme Russell pour leurs interventions. C'est un véritable drame humanitaire qui se joue sous nos yeux en Ukraine. L'agression russe tue chaque jour des civils, dont des enfants. Des infrastructures civiles essentielles sont détruites. Des hôpitaux et des écoles sont attaqués. La ville de Mariupol est assiégée, privant ses 450 000 habitants d'eau, de nourriture, de chauffage, d'électricité. Il y a déjà 1,7 million de réfugiés et ce n'est qu'un début. La France salue la solidarité dont les États européens, notamment la Pologne, la Hongrie, la Roumanie, la Slovaquie et la Moldavie font preuve. La France et ses partenaires de l'Union européenne se tiennent fermement aux côtés de l'Ukraine. L'Union européenne a annoncé 590 millions d'euros d'aide. La France prend également sa part. Elle a annoncé 100 millions d'euros et a déjà acheminé plus de 100 tonnes d'aide. La priorité, c'est une cessation immédiate des hostilités et le plein respect du droit international humanitaire. C'est le sens de l'engagement du président Macron. C'est aussi le message porté par tous les peuples du monde, comme l'ont montré les manifestations pour la paix au cours du week-end. De plus en plus de Russes aussi disent leur opposition à une guerre dont ils ne veulent pas, malgré les tentatives de les museler. Il est essentiel de protéger les civils, compris les enfants et les personnels humanitaires, ainsi que les infrastructures civiles. Le représentant permanent de la Fédération de Russie a souhaité évoquer l'éventuelle mise en place de corridors humanitaires et il a prêté des projets en la matière au président Macron. Permettez-moi juste de citer ce dernier il y a quelques heures. Les couloirs humanitaires, soyons clairs, c'est la possibilité de faire sortir ces femmes et ces hommes. La Russie plaide pour faire des couloirs humanitaires vers la Russie. Je ne connais pas beaucoup d'Ukrainiens qui ont envie d'aller se réfugier en Russie. C'est une hypocrisie. C'est pourquoi la France et le Mexique proposent une résolution demandant une cessation immédiate des hostilités et le plein respect du droit international humanitaire. Comme M. Griffiths et Mme Russell l'ont suggéré, ce Conseil doit assumer toutes ses responsabilités et mettre fin à cette tragédie. Il faut permettre aux personnes qui essaient de fuir l'Ukraine de le faire en toute sécurité et sans entrave. L'Ukraine a pris des engagements à ce sujet. La protection des civils et l'accès humanitaire doivent être garantis sur l'ensemble du territoire, tant pour les civils qui peuvent partir que pour ceux qui restent. Madame la Présidente, nous appelons la Fédération de Russie à se mettre en conformité avec la Charte des Nations Unies et à respecter le droit international, y compris le droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Toute la lumière doit être faite sur les allégations de crimes qui, s'ils sont établis, ne devront pas rester impunis. C'est pourquoi la France soutient la Cour pénale internationale et la commission d'enquête créée par le Conseil des droits de l'homme. La France salue le courage dont fait preuve le peuple d'Ukraine. Au sein des Nations Unies et dans toutes les enceintes, elle continuera de se mobiliser avec ses partenaires pour soutenir l'Ukraine et le peuple ukrainien. Je vous remercie.
أشكر ممثل فرنسا على بيانه. أعطي الكلمة لممثل الهند.
Thank you, Madam President. I join others in thanking Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell for their briefings. The worsening situation in Ukraine and ensuing humanitarian crisis deserve our immediate and urgent attention. As per the UN estimates, more than 1.5 million refugees have sought shelter in neighboring countries of Ukraine over the last 11 days. This has led to a pressing humanitarian crisis that needs to be addressed expeditiously. Numerous civilian lives have been lost so far, which also includes a young Indian student. India mourns his death, and we convey our deepest condolences to his family, just as we mourn the loss of each and every civilian life in the conflict. India has been consistent in calling for an immediate end to all hostilities. Our Prime Minister once again spoke to the leadership of both sides today and reiterated our call for immediate ceasefire and the need for both parties to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We have also reiterated our urgent demand for safe and uninterrupted passage for all innocent civilians, including Indian nationals remaining in Ukraine. We are deeply concerned that despite our repeated urgings to both sides, the safe corridor for our students stranded in Sumy did not materialize. We have managed to facilitate the safe return of over 20,000 Indians from Ukraine. We have also assisted nationals from other countries who approached us in their return to their respective countries, and we will remain open to doing so in the coming days. More than 80 evacuation flights have been crisscrossing the skies to bring them home. We are appreciative of the assistance rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in facilitating their return. We note the joint launch of the Flash Appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan by the Secretary General on Ukraine. We hope the international community will respond positively to the humanitarian needs. On its part, India has already sent 7 tranches of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. These include medicines, medical equipment, tents, protective eye gear, water storage tanks, solar lamps, amongst other relief material. We are in the process of identifying other such requirements and sending more supplies. Allow me to underscore that it is important that humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These should not be politicized. I thank you, Madam President.
أشكر ممثل الهند على بيانه. أعطي الكلمة لممثل غابون.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Je remercie le secrétaire général adjoint, M. Martin Griffiths, et la directrice exécutive de l'UNICEF, Catherine Russell, pour leur exposé édifiant. Nous prenons note de la nomination de M. Amin Ouad en qualité de coordonnateur des Nations Unies pour la crise en Ukraine. Madame la Présidente, une douzaine de jours après le début de la guerre en Ukraine, nous tenons aujourd'hui cette deuxième réunion sur la situation humanitaire qui nous donne des éléments d'appréciation de la situation sur le terrain en tenant compte du fait qu'en temps de conflit armé, la situation est non seulement susceptible d'évoluer très vite, mais encore que le contexte peut altérer nos projections ou notre jugement de la réalité. Je vais m'en tenir aux faits. Le 24 février dernier, la situation sécuritaire en Ukraine s'est embrasée. Les combats ont occasionné d'importantes pertes en vie humaine et conduit plus d'1 million de personnes à quitter le territoire ukrainien pour se réfugier dans les pays voisins. Les déplacements massifs de personnes dans des conditions particulièrement difficiles liées au froid exposent ces dernières à des besoins urgents de nourriture, d'eau et d'autres produits de première nécessité. De plus, les dommages et les destructions des infrastructures civiles dans les zones de combat et celles touchées par les frappes aériennes et les bombardements sont de nature à entraver l'accès des populations à l'eau, à la nourriture, aux soins de santé et à d'autres services de base. Nous sommes particulièrement préoccupés par les dommages causés aux personnes civiles, aux femmes, aux enfants, dont l'UNICEF évalue l'ampleur des besoins à plusieurs millions de personnes en danger. Mon pays demeure solidaire des populations en détresse et de toutes les personnes qui pâtissent des conséquences de cette guerre et invite les parties prenantes à créer des voies de sortie sûres et sans restriction des zones de combat. Nous appelons les belligérants à faciliter l'acheminement rapide, en toute sécurité et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire aux personnes qui en ont le besoin, de protéger les civils, y compris le personnel humanitaire et les personnes en situation vulnérable, en particulier les femmes, les personnes âgées, les personnes handicapées et les enfants, ceux conformément aux conventions de Genève. Nous saluons l'importante mobilisation multiforme de la communauté internationale qui se reflète par les dons en nature et en financement des partenaires bilatéraux et multilatéraux, notamment la Banque mondiale et le FMI, qui, dès les premiers jours de la guerre, ont activé leur mécanisme de financement rapide et promis de mobiliser 3 milliards de dollars, dont 550 millions à très court terme en vue de soutenir l'Ukraine. Cette mobilisation est un appui inestimable au plan de riposte humanitaire lancé récemment par les Nations Unies. Nous exprimons également notre appréciation vis-à-vis de l'élan de générosité des pays voisins de l'Ukraine qui font preuve d'un altruisme exemplaire dans l'accueil des réfugiés qui fuient les combats. C'est le lieu pour moi d'appeler au sens de l'humanité de tous pour offrir le même accueil à toutes les personnes en détresse sans distinction d'origine ou de race, y compris les ressortissants et étudiants africains, dont la détresse n'est pas moins grande dans cette situation de confusion et de terreur. Nous demandons le respect de leur dignité et appelons à un traitement équitable de toutes les personnes en détresse. En effet, Les informations concordantes qui nous parviennent de diverses sources font état de façon récurrente de discrimination et rétention d'étudiants africains dans les lieux à risque. Cette situation préoccupante et moralement insoutenable doit être unanimement et vigoureusement dénoncée. Madame la Présidente, mon pays appelle les belligérants à respecter les dispositions du droit international humanitaire, notamment les conventions de Genève et ses protocoles additionnels, à garantir le respect et la protection de l'ensemble du personnel médical et des agents humanitaires. Le Gabon salue l'établissement des couloirs humanitaires pour l'évacuation des civils des zones de combat et exhorte les parties au conflit à tout mettre en œuvre pour un cessez-le-feu immédiat. Je voudrais réitérer la position que mon pays a clairement exprimée devant l'Assemblée générale, à savoir que cette situation ne saurait prendre fin sans qu'une solution immédiate et pérenne soit trouvée pour stopper les combats. Cela implique que toutes les parties s'engagent dans des négociations de bonne foi avec la ferme volonté de mettre fin au conflit et d'en expurger toutes les racines. Pour terminer, j'appelle les membres de ce Conseil à saisir toute possibilité qu'offre la diplomatie pour parvenir à un règlement négocié et éviter un embrasement des hostilités. Dans ma culture africaine, lorsque deux congénères d'un même village en viennent aux mains, il revient aux proches voisins et amis respectifs d'arbitrer et de s'investir dans l'apaisement. L'expérience a souvent montré que plus tôt les amis et proches s'interposent, plus tôt l'accalmie revient. Et chaque fois que l'entourage s'engage en prenant position de part et d'autre dans l'affrontement, très souvent les hostilités s'enveniment. Bien entendu, lorsque le calme est établi, il est toujours bien plus aisé d'établir les responsabilités de façon holistique, dans la sérénité. C'est à l'aune de cette sagesse bantoue de l'Afrique que je voudrais réitérer à l'ensemble des parties notre appel au cessez-le-feu immédiat et à la désescalade. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
أشكر ممثل غابون على بيانه. أعطي الكلمة لممثل البرازيل.
Thank you. Madam President, let me thank you for convening this meeting and express my appreciation for USG Griffiths and Executive Director Russell for their briefings and their efforts in minimizing the human suffering in this tragic conflict. Brazil reiterates its grave concern with the humanitarian situation arising from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. First and foremost, we urge all parties to establish a ceasefire and engage in negotiations. The current situation can only bring more suffering and losses, especially in Ukraine, but potentially to the whole region. While hostilities continue, we call on all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law, including when resorting to new military technologies and cyber means. Parties must always uphold the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, and humanity. Brazil urges the parties to continue to establish humanitarian pauses and to create humanitarian corridors. We echo, nonetheless, the ICRC's concerns regarding the need to respect international humanitarian rules both for those who choose to leave and for those who remain. The rules of war are not optional. We insist on our call for safe, timely, and unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance to those in need, particularly the most vulnerable. We remind the plea echoed by many member states for neighboring countries to keep borders open to refugees without any kind of discrimination. Brazil reiterates its gratitude and solidarity to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and others who are facilitating the exit and reception of refugees. Madam President, when the lines between combatants and civilians become blurred, we risk seeing a rise in civilian casualties, especially in armed conflicts fought in urban areas when explosive weapons are used in these contexts. In the worst cases, children may suffer the direst consequences of armed conflicts. Children in Ukraine must be protected from the dangers of war and under no circumstances should be recruited, used, or allowed to join any military activity or take any direct part in hostilities. Attacks against civilian infrastructures, especially schools and medical facilities, as well as water and sanitation systems, must be avoided. Parties must respect the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in its entirety. Furthermore, no additional hardship should be imposed over the affected populations and vulnerable groups through broad economic sanctions. Children forced to flee their homes to ensure their own survival are especially vulnerable. The increasing number of internally displaced children in Ukraine and refugee children in neighboring countries will require support from the international community. From our side, following the swift establishment of a humanitarian visa policy for those fleeing the conflict, which entered into force on March 3rd, Brazilian embassies in Bratislava, Bucharest, Budapest, Prague, and Warsaw have started to grant special visas for displaced Ukrainians and stateless persons for humanitarian reception purposes. Madam President, a few days ago, the General Assembly sent a political message urging immediate peaceful resolution of the conflict. This is a strong call of the international community for peace. Now, the Security Council must play its part and genuinely contribute for a peaceful solution to this crisis. Garnering consensus in this Council around basic humanitarian messages is imperative. We must work collectively to widen humanitarian corridors and assistance and to open also the path for dialogue and diplomacy, guided by international law and the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل البرازيل على بيانه. أعطي الكلمة لممثل كينيا.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank USG Martin Griffiths and Executive Director Catherine Russell for their briefings, and I thank you for your work. I also welcome the participation of the distinguished permanent representative of Ukraine. Madam President, the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine is gravely concerning. Kenya offers its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflict in the last few days. Kenya also commends Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities. We urge them to ensure that the protection sought are offered with no discrimination on the basis, and particularly in regard to race or religion. Madam President, we are disturbed by the reported widespread damage to civilian objects and infrastructure. Kenya draws to the attention of the parties the need for them to comply with Security Council Resolution 2573 on protection of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population that was adopted by this Council in 2021. Madam President, Ukraine is a major producer of agricultural products that are key to assuring food security. The humanitarian impact of this conflict will be felt far beyond Ukraine because of the shock to the global food supply. Indeed, the closure of its ports as a result of the conflict, not to mention the destruction of infrastructure, is going to result in few grain and fertilizer exports. The resulting sharp prices increase are likely to plunge multiple countries into food insecurity and, as a result, possible political turmoil. In addition to Ukraine's key place in global food supply system being impacted by the conflict, the world will also suffer greatly from the unilateral and regional sanctions against the Russian Federation. We have previously urged that humanitarian and legal consideration be given to the impact on the Russian people of these sanctions. Now we must add our concern for the many, including in our own country, who will suffer all over the world. While the sanctions are aimed at responding to the inexcusable armed breach of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by the Russian Federation, they will end up harming not only the innocent in Russia, but also millions around the world, particularly in the global south. In this regard, I have two questions for USG Griffiths. First, would you make public your assessments on the impact of the armed conflict in Ukraine and the sanctions against the Russian Federation on the humanitarian situation in other countries, particularly in regard to food security? Second, what are the preventive actions that can be taken by the UN and the Security Council to ensure that the shock to the global food supply system does not translate to new crises? I wish to welcome the joint commitment by Ukraine and Russian Federation to establish humanitarian corridors for the safe passage of civilians and humanitarian supplies. However, during this past weekend, the humanitarian corridors have failed. We hope that the humanitarian corridors, particularly from Sumy, will be open to all foreign nationals and civilians tomorrow. Civilians and foreign nationals are not party to the conflict and must be protected at all times. They are not and must not be a target. We strongly urge both parties to ensure their safe passage. We commend the United Nations and its partner agencies for their continued efforts to provide humanitarian assistance. In particular, we welcome the identification of 4 humanitarian hubs in Lviv, Phoenicia, Uzhhorod, and Genevsky. Ultimately, Madam President, the only way out of this crisis is for a ceasefire and dialogue to protect Ukrainian sovereignty and shape a stable European security order. I close by reiterating Kenya's recognition of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل كينيا على بيانه. أعطي الكلمة لممثلة غانا.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank you for convening today's session. I would also like to express my delegation's appreciation to the UNICEF Executive Director, Ms. Catherine Russell, for highlighting the impact that the conflict has had on children in Ukraine. Let me also thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths for the updated situational report on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Ghana is alarmed at the exponentially high levels of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine since this Council's first consideration of the matter on February 28 this year. At the time, it was reported that about 100,000 people were displaced, as some 500,000 more attempted to flee from shelling of heavy artillery, missiles, and airstrikes in the cities. Today, and only a week later, nearly 1,200 casualties have been recorded since the start of the conflict. 1.7 million people have fled the cities of Ukraine to neighboring countries, and some 160,000 have been internally displaced. What remains unchanged, however, are the principles and the responsibility to ensure the protection of all persons suffering under the weight of the raging conflict in Ukraine. We must therefore uphold the legitimacy of the international norms of the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols that require of conflicting parties a duty to preserve the sanctity of human life, by taking necessary precautions to spare the lives of civilians and avoid the destruction of civilian infrastructure during the time of war. All member states are duty-bound to comply with their international law obligations, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. Failure to do so constitutes serious violations which cannot and must not be ignored. It is regrettable that the agreement reached between the two sides for the creation of humanitarian corridors for safe evacuations and the safe passage of food and medicines did not hold. We join other members of this Council in reiterating the call for a humanitarian pause to allow the evacuation of civilians, especially in the cities of Mariupol and Kharkiv, where intense military operations are ongoing. We call for the immediate cessation of hostilities in residential and civilian populated areas. It is also vital that agreements are reached to allow windows of silence that will enable the safe and unhindered passage of humanitarian convoys to all areas where civilians remain in need of water, food, and medical care. Ghana further supports the United Nations ask for the urgent establishment of a notification system and an emergency hotline with both the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian government to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid and life-saving supplies. Moreover, we are compelled to reiterate the absolute importance for the parties to steer away the military hostilities from all nuclear installations in Ukraine to avoid the risk of a nuclear disaster. We urge the IAEA to continue to monitor activities within Ukraine's nuclear program and operationalize preventive mechanisms to avert any accidental occurrences. We take note of the complex environment within which the humanitarian agencies are operating and commend them for their commitment. We also acknowledge those member states and international institutions which have contributed to the humanitarian fund required to ensure adequate humanitarian response. We are disheartened by the trauma and the suffering that children in Ukraine are experiencing during this period. These are the succeeding generations we pledge to save from the scourge of war. We commend UNICEF for its active engagement in the humanitarian operations and encourage the humanitarian agencies in their effort to address the peculiar vulnerabilities of children, as well as the women, the aged, and persons with disabilities. Madam President, I wish to take this opportunity to commend the neighboring countries of Ukraine and other European countries who have opened their borders to offer refuge to persons fleeing the conflict. We continue to prevail on them in their efforts to be guided by the principles of humanity and neutrality, impartiality, and independence. In closing, Madam President, I must re-echo the call upon the Russian Federation to end the aggression against the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and withdraw its military forces. We firmly believe that military options will not deliver the mutual demands of security between Russian Federation and Ukraine. As the humanitarian situation in Ukraine worsens, economic ramifications are already being felt globally. We hope that this Council will take a unified path to support efforts to resolve the conflict through diplomacy and dialogue. I thank you.
أشكر ممثلة غانا على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة لممثلة النرويج.
Thank you, President. Let me begin by thanking the briefers for their sobering account on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, particularly for outlining the terrifying ordeal many children are facing. We are seriously concerned by the staggering numbers of civilian casualties in Ukraine. Children have been killed and wounded. Children have lost their homes. Let me underline that Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis. The Russian aggression against Ukraine must stop now. Troops must be withdrawn immediately. Civilians, including children, and civilian infrastructure must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. We are deeply concerned by the reported use of cluster munition by Russian forces in Ukraine. These are inherently indiscriminate weapons. They continue to kill and injure children long after conflict ends. Children are traumatized as they seek shelter from the bombing and shelling, forced to flee across Ukraine and across borders, putting them at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. We are deeply concerned about unaccompanied children separated from their families. Every effort must be made to restore family links and trace missing persons. Humanitarian organizations must give priority to the assistance and protection of children affected by conflict, including the need for mental health and psychosocial support. President, Russia's warfare in urban and populated areas and the use of heavy explosive weapons is causing terrible long-term harm on civilians and cause the most severe physical harm to children, killing and maiming them. With attacks on hospitals, water processing plants, food system, and other civilian infrastructure, children are being deprived of services essential for their life and health. The fighting around nuclear plants endangers the health and safety of today's children and those of future generations in Ukraine and beyond. And schools are under attack. These attacks represent a clear violation of a Resolution 2601 on the protection of education in armed conflict, which this Council unanimously adopted only a few months ago. We call on the Russian Federation to respect the civilian characters of schools and educational facilities in accordance with international humanitarian law. President, we stand behind and support OCHA's call today for concrete steps to be taken to ensure protection of civilians and humanitarian access. We call on the parties to the conflict to comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law to allow and facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need. The space for humanitarian action must be restored and protected in a way that ensures continuous and sustained humanitarian access. Civilians must be protected at all times. Ceasefire agreements and so-called humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians can be measured for this purpose. Evacuation of civilians must be safe, voluntary, and to destination of their own choosing. Unclear agreements won't meet the needs of the civilian population. Those civilians who are leaving and also those civilians who are remaining must be protected. We commend the neighboring countries for keeping the borders open and for the great generosity and solidarity shown with people fleeing the conflict. The door to safety and protection must remain open without discrimination. We also commend all the humanitarian organizations, and in particular the local organizations, for their heroic efforts to deliver life-saving aid. Medical and humanitarian workers must be protected. They are not a target. President, Norway condemns Russia's massive military aggression against Ukraine. We reiterate our call on Russia to withdraw its troops immediately and stop causing further death, suffering, and destruction. The 7.5 million children of Ukraine are seeing the places they live, play, and learn being damaged and destroyed. Their lives and future are at stake. This war must stop now. Dialogue and diplomacy are the only way forward. Thank you.
ممثلة النرويج على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة لممثل الصين.
谢谢主席女士。主席女士，我首先感谢格里菲斯副秘书长和拉塞尔执行主任刚才所做的通报。我们对仍在急剧变化的乌克兰局势表示关切。有关平民伤亡上升的报道令人痛惜。我们呼吁保持最大限度的克制，切实加大外交努力，让战火尽早停下来，有效保障平民生命财产安全和基本需求，防止出现大规模的人道主义危机。 俄罗斯、乌克兰通过谈判就建立人道走廊达成共识。我们希望双方克服执行过程中遇到的困难，确保人道走廊安全通畅。中国国务院兼外长王毅今天提出关于乌克兰人道局势的6点倡议：一是人道主义行动必须遵守联大第46182号决议确立的人道、中立、公正的基本原则，防止将人道问题政治化；二是全面关注乌克兰的流离失所者，特别是为收容他们的主要国家提供人道主义援助，帮助其妥善安置；三是切实保护平民，特别是保障妇女、儿童、老年人、残疾人等脆弱群体的权益，努力防止乌克兰境内出现粮食短缺、传染病等次生人道灾害；四是保障人道援助活动顺利、安全开展，包括提供快速、安全、无障碍的人道主义准入，保护医疗人员和从事医疗工作人员的安全，保护用于人道救援行动的医疗设备、交通工具和重要民用基础设施等等。五是确保在乌克兰的外国人安全，允许其从乌克兰安全有保障、不受限地离开，并为其回国提供帮助。六是支持联合国在对乌克兰人道援助方面发挥协调作用，支持联合国乌克兰危机协调员的工作。在组织中国公民避难和撤离过程中，乌克兰政府和社会各界给予了友好协助。俄罗斯、摩尔多瓦、罗马尼亚、波兰、匈牙利、斯洛伐克、白俄罗斯等国也提供了宝贵的支持。我们向各国政府和人民表示衷心的感谢。主席女士，乌克兰局势发展到今天，原因错综复杂，解决复杂问题需要的是冷静和理性，而不是火上浇油，激化矛盾。化解乌克兰危机，必须坚持联合国宪章宗旨和原则，尊重和保障各国的主权和领土完整，必须坚持安全不可分割原则，照顾当事方的合理安全关切，必须坚持通过对话原则，以和平方式解决争端。凡是有助于缓和局势和政治解决的努力，中方都支持；凡是不利于推动外交解决，而是拱火浇油，使局势升级的行动，中方都反对。我们对不断强化的单边制裁措施深表关切，这不是解决问题的根本有效途径，还会产生严重人道主义后果，其外溢影响也将给其他国家造成损失。向乌克兰境内输送进攻性武器，派遣雇佣军，可能使局势更加恶化，带来更多更大的风险。中国将继续为和平发声，为和平尽力。我们鼓励俄罗斯和乌克兰继续进行直接谈判，期待双方谈出结果，谈出和平。中国一贯致力于劝和促谈。冲突发生的第二天，习近平主席应约同普京总统通话时，就提出愿看到俄乌双方尽早和谈。普京总统也作出积极的回应。 中方也愿在需要时与国际社会一道，开展必要的斡旋。我们也鼓励美国、北约、欧盟与俄罗斯开展平等对话，直面多年来积累的矛盾和问题，重视北约连续东扩对俄罗斯安全环境造成的负面影响，按照安全不可分割原则，寻求构建均衡、有效、可持续的欧洲安全机制。我谢谢你，主席女士。
أشكر ممثل الصين على بيانه. سأدلي الآن ببيان بصفتي ممثلة الإمارات العربية المتحدة. أود بداية أن أشكر السيد مارتن جريفيثس وكيل الأمين العام للشؤون الإنسانية ومنسق الإغاثة في حالات الطوارئ، والسيدة كاثرين راسل المديرة التنفيذية لليونيسف على إحاطتيهما. كما أشار المتحدثون قبلي، فقد وصلت الأوضاع الإنسانية في أوكرانيا إلى مستويات كارثية، حيث يواجه اليوم أكثر من 40 مليون أوكراني، منهم 7.5 مليون طفل، حالة من انعدام الأمن وإضرار وتدمير في البنية التحتية ونقص شديد في الخدمات الأساسية. وكما ذكر هناك ما يقارب 1,700,000 أوكراني ما بين نازح ولاجئ في الوقت الذي تستمر فيه أعداد القتلى والجرحى بالارتفاع. في ظل هذه الحقائق المريرة يتعين علينا كمجتمع دولي بذل قصارى جهودنا للتخفيف من المعاناة الإنسانية للأوكرانيين بشكل عاجل، مع تكثيف مساعينا لإنهاء القتال وإيجاد حل مستدام للأزمة الحالية. ومن هذا المنطلق ترى دولة الإمارات أهمية التركيز على المسائل التالية. أولاً، ندعو كافة الأطراف إلى احترام التزاماتها بموجب القانون الإنساني الدولي، ويتضمن هذا بشكل أساسي الحاجة إلى عدم جعل المدنيين والأعيان المدنية ومنها المدارس والمستشفيات موضع استهداف. ونشير أيضاً إلى أن تدمير البنية التحتية في أوكرانيا يؤثر بشدة على الأوضاع الإنسانية، مع صعوبة الحصول على الاحتياجات الملحة مثل المياه والخدمات الصحية والإمدادات الغذائية. كذلك لابد من السماح بوصول المساعدات الإنسانية للمحتاجين دون تقييد ذلك بأي اتفاقات لوقف إطلاق النار، فضلاً عن ضمان سلامة العاملين في المنظمات الإنسانية. ونؤكد على ضرورة وقف الأعمال العدائية للسماح للمدنيين المنكوبين بالخروج من المدن التي تتعرض للعنف، ومنها ماريبول وكاركيف وسومي. ويؤسفنا بشدة في هذا السياق انهيار الممرات الإنسانية التي تم الاتفاق عليها، وندرك أن الممرات الإنسانية هي حلول مؤقتة وغير مثالية، ولا تعد بديلاً عن احترام القانون الدولي الإنساني. ومع ذلك يمكن للممرات الإنسانية المنشأة بطريقة مناسبة أن تكون بمثابة إجراءات فورية، بينما ننظر في كافة السبل التي يمكن أن تساهم في حماية المدنيين. ثانياً، هناك حاجة ماسة لوجود مبادرات عملية تساهم في بناء الثقة بين الأطراف المتنازعة وضمان احترام القانون الإنساني الدولي. فمثلاً ينبغي تحديد رفات القتلى واحترامها، وينبغي التنسيق لإعادتها متى أمكن ذلك. كما ينبغي توفير الحماية من قبل الأطراف لكافة الأفراد المحمين بموجب القانون الإنساني الدولي، ومنهم الجنود الجرحى أو المرضى أو الأسرى. ثالثاً، نناشد المجتمع الدولي بتكثيف الجهود لتوفير الدعم الإنساني لأوكرانيا بشكل عاجل، بما في ذلك عبر المساهمة في تلبية النداء الإنساني العاجل للأمم المتحدة والخطة الإقليمية للاستجابة للاجئين في أوكرانيا وغيرها من المبادرات. ونشيد هنا بدور الأمانة العامة للأمم المتحدة في دعم وتنسيق الاستجابة الإنسانية، والتي يجب أن تركز بشكل خاص على النساء والأطفال. كذلك نثني على الجهود التي تبذلها دول الجوار في استقبال الأوكرانيين. من جانبها ستقدم دولة الإمارات 5 ملايين دولار أمريكي للتخفيف من معاناة الأوكرانيين، فضلاً عن إرسالنا لأوكرانيا 30 طناً من الإمدادات الطبية والإغاثية اليوم. وختاماً، نؤكد أن حل الأزمة الإنسانية جذرياً وتجنب وقوع المزيد من الأضرار والضحايا يتطلب في المقام الأول ضبط النفس والتوصل إلى وقف فوري لإطلاق النار في كافة أنحاء أوكرانيا، إلى جانب تفعيل القنوات الدبلوماسية لإنهاء النزاع بشكل مستدام. ونرحب بمواصلة انخراط المجتمع الدولي على مستويات رفيعة مع كل من الطرفين، والتي نرى أن من شأنها أن تساهم في المضي قدما نحو التوصل إلى حل دبلوماسي بما يخدم صون السلم والأمن الإقليميين والدوليين ويحفظ كرامة واحتياجات ملايين المدنيين. وشكرا. أستأنف مهامي كرئيسة للمجلس. أعطي الكلمة لممثل أوكرانيا.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, Mr. Under-Secretary General, Madam Executive Director, 12 days of all-out Russian invasion in Ukraine, including from the territory of Belarus, have brought us on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe of potentially global nature. I would like to thank all countries who accept the Ukrainian refugees and let other foreign nationals to their territory. As we have already heard, more than 1.7 million people, mostly women and children, have already fled from the war unleashed, unprovoked by Russia. In Sachsenhausen, in Germany, in the spring of 1942, an extermination unit was built in the industrial yard with a crematorium and a neck shot unit with a gas chamber added in 1943. The SS cynically named this building Station Z or Station Z. Z is a letter that Russian military is putting on their vehicles departing to Ukraine. Some interpret Z as za pobedu in Russian, or for victory in English. Some say it is Zapad in Russian, or West in English. I would insist it is Z for zveri, or animals, or rather beasts in English. Russia continues to cynically disregard the norms of international humanitarian law during hostilities. Russian troops block numerous attempts of the Ukrainian authorities to evacuate civilians through humanitarian corridors. They denied access of international organizations to provide humanitarian assistance to the most affected places. It is even more appalling that the Russian troops open firing on evacuees and evacuation vehicles, shell the roads allocated for humanitarian corridors. For instance, they shelled depots with evacuation buses near Mariupol, blew up railway near Irpin in the Kiev region to prevent evacuation by train, destroyed the bridge on the way to Volnovakha. All the mentioned were the main routes to evacuate civilians. As it was stated today by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, I quote, "Today, in violation of the previously reached agreements, the Russian Federation yet again disrupted the opening of the humanitarian corridors for evacuation of the civilian population from the besieged cities of the suburbs of Kiev, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Kherson regions. Russia's armed forces continue bombing and missile attacks on Kiev, Mariupol, Volnovakha, Sumy, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and other cities, towns, and villages. This prevents the safe exit of humanitarian convoys carrying Ukrainian and foreign citizens, as well as delivery of medications and food." End of quote. Today, the hearings on the Ukraine's lawsuit against Russia in genocide case have been commenced at the UN International Court of Justice. As an immediate action, Ukraine appeals to the ICJ to impose the precautionary measures in this case in order to stop the bloodshed. We condemn Russia's unwillingness to fully implement the UN General Assembly resolution on aggression against Ukraine, in particular to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine. In fact, Russia does not fully implement it, doesn't implement it at all. First of all, Russia must stop violating the ceasefire arrangements aimed at ensuring rapid, safe, and unhindered passage through humanitarian corridors. It must put an end to spreading disinformation and manipulating the lives of civilians. Evacuation through humanitarian corridors is only possible when the ceasefire regime is fully upheld. The Ukrainian side is ready for that. We also consider as inappropriate any attempts by Moscow to force civilians, both Ukrainian citizens and foreigners, in the besieged cities to flee to the territory of Russia and Belarus, taking into account high probability of provocations, in particular taking those evacuated as hostages or using them by the Russian armed forces as a human shield. It looks especially cynical when European borders are widely open for refugees from Ukraine. And I totally agree with my friend Nicola, who said it's pure hypocrisy to push Ukrainians to Belarus or to Russia. Ukraine calls on the member states to spare no effort in forcing Russia to uphold the ceasefire regime in order to open humanitarian corridors and prevent a large-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Life is very dynamic. And unfortunately, while we were sitting here and discussing our business, another appalling example of Russia's disregard of its own commitments on humanitarian corridors has taken place just now. According to available information from my capital, Russia has undermined arrangements on humanitarian corridors for tomorrow. And I regret, my dear ambassadors, all of you who called me today when we discussed this business. The arrangement was made and it was broken by the Russians. Despite a route through Poltava being agreed, including with the ICRC, Russian side has already sent us a letter with routes to Russia and Belarus only. I call on the Russian side to reverse to the previously agreed routes to allow Ukrainian and foreign citizens to leave for Europe. Today, more than hundreds of Ukrainian cities and villages attacked and sieged by the aggressor state. And they are on the verge of humanitarian disaster. The population does not have access to drinking water, food, medicine, electricity, heating, and other basic necessities. Much of the environmental damage inflicted on Ukraine by the Russian invasion will likely prove irreparable in the near future. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 teaches us that the effects of nuclear accidents endure for hundreds and even thousands of years. The CO2 being released as a result of Russia's scorched earth tactics will likewise linger in the atmosphere for the long term, compounding the effects on climate change and greenhouse effect. So for Ukraine has been one of the guarantors of global food security so far. I apologize. Now this status is challenged by the Russian war against Ukraine. the implications at the global level will be catastrophic. Just a few examples. 55% of sunflower oil exported worldwide comes from Ukraine. 55%. 60% of Ukrainian agricultural products are exported through seaports. The closure of ports and the sea by the Russian army threatens the global supply chain. It means that defending Ukraine from the Russian aggression also protects the world from hunger. Given that Russian leadership attempts to conceal real losses and resolutely denies any discussions on the ways to return their soldiers' bodies, Ukraine is facing additional threat of the health crisis. We are speaking about dozens of thousands of bodies decomposing in the fields of Ukraine, bodies of the Russian soldiers. In this regard, we call on the ICRC to set up a database of fallen occupiers, prisoners of war, on the basis of the Central Investigation Agency of the ICRC, as well as to provide assistance in returning the remains of the fallen occupiers to Russia. According to the Ministry of Education, more than 211 Ukrainian schools have been damaged or destroyed by the Russian military forces since the beginning of the invasion. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been deprived from their right to education. According to the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, as of March 6, 34 hospitals were destroyed. The World Health Organization has reported that 6 Ukrainian doctors were killed and 11 wounded as a result of the Russian shellings. Given the threat of bombing and shelling, hospitals and maternity wards have moved their patients to the basements. The country is running low on critical medical supplies. Therefore, we call on all the UN humanitarian missions to act decisively to respond to the growing humanitarian crisis without delay. Yesterday, our occupants completely destroyed the city airport of Vinnytsia. It must be noted that the Assistant Secretary General, UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine, Amin Awad, announced that Vinnytsia was prepared to be a main hub to all UN humanitarian missions. Distinguished members of the Security Council, the Russian occupiers are killing Ukrainian children, consciously and cynically. At least 38 children have been already killed since Russia's full-scale armed aggression against Ukraine. More than 70 kids were seriously wounded. Due to the ongoing shelling of civilian infrastructure in many cities, this number may be increasing right now. Ukraine deeply regrets that more than 2,000 citizens of India, China, Turkey, Pakistan, and other countries suffer today along with Ukrainians from Russian aggression. The government of Ukraine is in 24/7 contact with diplomatic missions and consulates of foreign countries to ensure that their citizens can safely return to their countries as soon as possible. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has established an emergency hotline for foreign citizens wishing to leave Ukraine because of the Russian armed aggression. The Ukrainian border guards, in cooperation with colleagues from neighboring EU countries and Moldova, are doing everything possible to speed up the passage of all refugees from Ukraine and have never created obstacles that would hinder this. We would like to reiterate that the only root cause of ongoing massive humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, including the situation at the western border of Ukraine, is the armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Russia bears full responsibility for the killing and injuring of innocent people, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and obstacles for the safe departure of Ukrainians and foreign citizens. The government of Ukraine works 24/7 to set up the mechanisms for reliable supplies of food, medications, and essential commodities throughout the country. on the 2nd of March, President Zelensky established the Coordination Office on Humanitarian and Social Issues. Ukraine has received more than 3,500 tons of humanitarian aid, and we are grateful to all our partners for this manifestation of support. Despite enemy attacks, all systems ensuring the proper functioning of the state are intact. There is undeniable stability in the work of the Ukrainian government. Despite the war, Ministry of Social Policy and Pension Fund have paid all pensions to almost 13 million retired citizens of Ukraine. The government prepared an assistance program for all Ukrainians who have lost their jobs as a result of war. Private businesses and employees who lost jobs due to war will receive financial support in March. Ukrainian railways started procuring food, fuel, medicines, electricity, and other important goods and services for the population. The enterprise will be in close contact with military administrations and address the most pressing needs of people and the state. Dear colleagues, in Ukraine, people in Ukraine value the words of support. At the same time, they require concrete actions to save their lives, their health, their property. It is also already clear to everyone that the fragility of the situation reaches beyond Ukraine, into Europe and across the world. We expect that the Council to be decisive in responding to the worst humanitarian crisis we have ever seen since the end of the Second World War in Europe. You know, before I conclude, one of my colleagues, after the last Security Council session, said, you know, the colleague said, it looks like a group therapy. We are all here trying to bring to sanity one member. And indeed, when I listen to this member, to this representative of that country, I think it's absolutely right that the Department of Health of the City of New York is called Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Because it's very difficult after these meetings where we listen to the persistent lies and delirium coming from that particular country. I think that it's not only the Russian diplomats in New York who need mental assistance, but also those who posted today this text. Foreign Minister Lavrov, the goal of Russia's special military operation is to stop any war that could take place on Ukrainian territory or that could start from there. Russian embassy in London, retweeted by the Russian Foreign Ministry. Let me remind the Russian diplomats that in London, in case of need for mental help, you can dial NHS line 111. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل أوكرانيا على بيانه. طلب ممثل الاتحاد الروسي الكلمة للإدلاء ببيان آخر. أعطي الكلمة لممثل الاتحاد الروسي.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. Я взял слово не для того, чтобы полемизировать с украинским представителем. У меня другая задача, я к ней вернусь. Хотя, конечно, не сказать несколько слов в отношении того, что говорил украинский постред, невозможно. Он интерпретировал букву Z на российской военной технике, которая сейчас находится на Украине, как звери. Ну, у нас свое мнение о том, кто является зверьми. В частности, те представители вооруженных сил Украины, национальных батальонов, которые на протяжении 8 лет утюжили мирное население Донбасса. И, кстати, это продолжается. Сейчас идут обстрелы Луганска, горят нефтехранилища. То же самое в Донбассе. Это никуда не делось. Нас обвинили в том, что мы срываем операцию по эвакуации людей через гуманитарные коридоры, но все на самом деле с точностью да наоборот. Это украинская сторона не согласилась с нашим предложением о прекращении огня и выводе людей через эти мирные коридоры. А как мы уже говорили, национальные батальоны в городах удерживают людей, как живые щиты, размещая технику в жилых кварталах. У меня здесь только что я получил видео с телеграммы о том, как при попытке вывести из Мариуполя в направлении Новоазовска по гуманитарному коридору на трассе М-23 национальным батальоном Азовом были обстреляны мирные жители. Это все доступно в интернете. Я хотел бы, собственно говоря, я попросил слова, чтобы сообщить вам о том, что мне поступило сообщение об экстренном заявлении совместного координационного штаба по гуманитарной ситуации на Украине, датированное сегодняшним числом. Я не буду его зачитывать, естественно, целиком. Мы распространим это заявление в ближайшее время среди членов Совета Безопасности, но речь в нем идет о том, что российская сторона вновь предлагает завтра, 8 марта, с 10 утра по московскому времени, осуществить прекращение огня, открыть гуманитарные коридоры для эвакуации мирных жителей Киева, Чернигова, Сум, Харькова, Мариуполя. И мой украинский коллега сказал, что Украина готова работать в этом направлении. Посмотрим, какой ответ нам дадут на это предложение российские власти. Кстати, хочу сказать, что в этих предложениях не содержится требования о том, что эвакуируемые украинские граждане непременно направлялись на территорию Российской Федерации. Там есть и направление, там есть эвакуация в направлении украинских городов к западу от Киева. И в конце концов это будет выбор самих жителей, которые будут эвакуироваться. Ну, я не хочу комментировать последнее заявление украинского представителя. Мне только очень непонятно, откуда ему так хорошо известны адреса нью-йоркских учреждений, которые занимаются психическим здоровьем. Хотелось бы узнать об этом подробнее. Благодарю вас.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه. لم يعد هناك أسماء مدرجة في قائمة المتكلمين. سأعلن الآن رفع الجلسة ليتسنى للمجلس مواصلة مناقشته لهذا الموضوع في مشاورات مغلقة، وأرجو من جميع المراقبين مغادرة القاعة مباشرة فور رفع هذه الجلسة. رفعت الجلسة.
Speak out.